Okay. Hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining the Wolf Conservation Center for our webinar to celebrate Red Wolf Week. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. The Wolf Conservation Center works to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery, and we're funded by people like you. So thank you. Our scientific webinar series allows us to bridge the gap between research and the general public, which allows for engaging discussions and increased advocacy. We're so excited to be joined by Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Conservation Center's senior research scientist. Joey earned his PhD from the University of Georgia, and his research background focuses on the conservation and management of canids, specifically red wolves and coyotes. Joey often conducts field research involving morphometrics, mark recapture methods, radio tracking techniques, and GPS and GIS applications to understand population dynamics and distribution. He is the head of the Wolf Conservation Center's research lab, as you'll see on his screen, and his ongoing projects include the ecology and conservation of the reintroduced red wolf population in North Carolina, the ecology and management of coyotes throughout the southeastern U.S., assessing the taxonomy and ecology of canids along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, and the ecology and management of moose in the Adirondack Park. Today is especially exciting because in addition to celebrating Red Wolf Week with this webinar, we also have the opportunity to fundraise for additional tracking collars for wild red wolves and coyotes, thanks to a generous $25,000 match provided by an anonymous donor. Joey will discuss this initiative during his presentation, and I'll include a link in the chat as well. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. You can use two Zoom features to communicate with us. You can use the chat feature or the Q&A box. We will have a designated question and answer at the end of the webinar. If you want a question to be answered during the program, you need to type it into the Q&A box, not the chat box. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Wolf Center's YouTube channel within the next week. All right, Joey, I'll turn things over to you.
All right, thanks, Regan. Greetings, everyone. Appreciate you guys joining us tonight for this webinar. Yeah, this one's going to be on just me covering basically the history of Canis in the eastern U.S., mostly with red wolves, starting with their emergence in the fossil record, and then some historical interactions that we've had with them through colonization up until their recent extirpation. The recovery efforts in North Carolina, plus some of our ongoing research. I also want to use, I guess, the webinar as an opportunity sort of just to introduce the research lab here at the Wolf Conservation Center and sort of what the purpose of the lab is. The lab's not old. It's probably about, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years old. It started when I joined, and since then we've expanded to 2, 3 people now. And we have a name that's underneath my name there. It's the Integrative Ecology and Coexistence Lab. And I'll start covering that here in a minute. Just to sort of introduce the lab. Oh, the outline for the talk first is, like I mentioned, I want to sort of give you guys a background on the lab, what we're doing here. And then history of Canis in the southeastern U.S., then talk about some of the projects that we're doing under certain, I guess, research areas. So the third objective here, or outline bullet, is the historical ecology and socio-ecological research. And then, of course, assessing the red wolf sort of legacy along the Gulf Coast where that last wild population existed before we purposely extirpated them to sort of save them and initiate the captive breeding program. And then ways that we feel that our research at the lab could help reinvigorate red wolf recovery. And so starting off with the first one, lab members. There's me. I go by Joey. So Joey Hinton's me. I did my PhD at the University of Georgia. I consider myself an applied wildlife ecologist. Most of my research over the past 20 years has focused on canid ecology, specifically red wolves and coyotes. Coming out of my undergrad, in 2002, I did a 10-month internship with the Red Wolf Recovery Program. Left to do some other research projects, came back as a master's student to study red wolf pup attendance and habitat use and whatnot. Left again, came back for another 18 months to do black bear and red wolf work in that area. Left and then came back and started my PhD it's been like that for 20 years. So lots of experience there for me. Sunny is from California. She's our research associate in the lab. She's finishing up her master's. She's all but done with her master's at the American Public University. She's basically our socioecologist and science communicator here at the Wolf Center. A lot of her research and interests focus on the human and wildlife interactions, and especially with communities for diasporic Africans and Indigenous communities. And then there's Colleen O'Donnell. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. She's part-time with us. We are supporting some of her work there at the university. And so she assists on a number of things for us regarding the lab in terms of grant writing and working on projects to do research on red wolves. And her dissertation is focusing on the effects of, I guess, social tolerance and anthropogenic landscapes on red wolf persistence. So she just started her program, so she'll be around for the next few years. So what are we doing? So here at the lab, like I said, we're new. It's only been around for about 3 years. We're trying to build the lab into sort of an important laboratory for studying wildlife and their habitats and influence and management. Specifically for, canids, being a wolf center, would focus mostly on wolves, obviously, and coyotes. Given my background, which is mostly traditional ecology, sort of want to study the distribution and population dynamics of these species. So basically figure out what the extent of a population is, why it occurs there, and what are the important underlying processes that are allowing these populations to persist, things that affect reproduction, things that affect survival and immigration and emigration. Of course, these animals mostly live in environments that are largely anthropogenic. So a lot of times when we think about habitat, we think about habitat in terms of like prey density or like vegetation, community, and climate, but we often don't recognize humans and sort of anthropogenic components of the landscape as being part of their habitats. But they are. And so part of what we are trying to do now to incorporate into our research is these socioeconomic factors that may influence our interactions with wildlife populations, such as wolves or coyotes or white-tailed deer or whatever, and our cultural perspectives and how we manage them. A lot of that is Sunny's work. And then we want to collectively use these components to assess strategies for population recovery and management. In the case of the red wolf, how does anthropogenic mortality affect their survival and their persistence, their interactions with coyotes, hybridization with coyotes and whatnot, and how do we refine their strategies to ensure that recovery can move forward and be successful. And as I keep mentioning, our focal species are red wolves and coyotes. Let's see. So the overall mission here at the Wolf Conservation Center is basically to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery. The vision that at least we have for the research lab is to lead impactful research that sort of to succeed in that mission. And so that would be, making advances in the conservation and management of wolves that allow us to recover their populations. And so our research tends to focus on several areas. These areas are not areas for wildlife, but for humans. When we think about community, we go into certain areas to do research. If it's in North Carolina, I'd be working with the local communities on the 5-county area on the Albemarle Peninsula. If it's down in Louisiana and Texas, it's work with those local communities. If it's around the Wolf Center, as we have some projects going on there now, it's working with our local community around the New York City area. This type of interactions with the communities where we're doing research establishes not just collaborations that we have with like academics and federal and state agency folks, but also with folks locally in that community so that they can sort of participate in the research and have a say in what's happening. And this develops leadership roles on all those aspects or all those ends. For us to step into important roles and have leadership roles in research, and for the local community, for them to take ownership of these projects and ongoing work. And it helps mobilize support too. So in situations where we need to gather up support for either red wolves or, increase better, I guess protection for coyotes or something. The local folks who are participating in research have buy-in, they're invested in these populations, and so therefore they can be easily mobilized to support anything that would benefit these wildlife populations. The research, obviously has to be focused on applied questions, since we're working with heavily managed populations, whether they're, like I said, wolves or coyotes. And so hopefully doing this type of research, incorporating the socioeconomic or social, cultural, or ecological aspects of the research in with the traditional types of research that we do, we can bring in new perspectives that could improve management and develop new techniques. Some of the education's components of the lab, as you see here, is doing webinars to sort of spread these findings out, interact with the public. Workshops, as you'll see in the back end of the talk, we have some collaboration with some other social ecologists doing surveys to measure people's attitudes or support for red wolf recovery. And so we've held workshops on how to do that, bringing scientists together to refine those techniques and come up with ways to analyze that data and figure out like publication paths, what kind of papers we want to publish and whatnot, and how to approach our agencies with that data. And from there, and of course, this is all labor and work. And so it's important for us to use the lab as an entry point to start careers. So for those of us that are here permanently, like me and Sunny, this is long-term employment. In the case of, as you saw with Sunny, being an African-American woman, this is an entry point for her and other historically excluded people. And of course, for graduate students and early career researchers who are looking for experience, even though it may not be full-time work, it's still important, opportunities for them to get experience and pay that they can use to leverage into new positions. So sort of have a big vision here in terms of what we can do for not just wildlife, but for people in general. So now that we're shifted into, this is just a slide to sort of let me know that we're shifted into discussing the history of Canis in the Southeastern US. So here in North America, we have 4 primary Canis species. The 2 on the left, most people know, Canis lupus, the gray wolf, and Canis latrans, the coyote. These are 2 Western species. Coyotes are common all over North America now, as everyone knows. These are two most well-known Canis species in North America. The 2 on the right are lesser-known species. The eastern wolf is a small population up in Ontario. That's a North American evolved animal that's closely related to the coyote. And then throughout most of the eastern US, particularly in the Southeast, we had red wolves. This is what we're going to spend most of the time discussing today. The red wolf, of course, is something that's endemic to the US. The last known populations were along the Mississippi River Basin. And now there's a small reintroduced population in North Carolina. So one of the primary characteristics for these 4 species is that they form monogamous breeding pairs, meaning that the males and the females will pair up together and they stay as a faithful pair. And so the male doesn't mate multiple females. He mates one female. When she whelps some pups, the male contributes to pup rearing. It's not something that's unloaded on the female on her own. So the males don't, they're not just spreading their seed. They do actually contribute to raising their offspring. To Canis, you don't see this in a lot of different mammalian groups. And so coyotes do it, which is commonly a myth to think that they don't have large packs. They actually do pack up quite a bit. And of course, as they get larger in size, they become more obligated in monogamous breeding. And then, of course, that delayed dispersal is how you get pack dynamics. So, you have mom and dad pair up. It's their first season. They drop pups. Some of those pups will hang around for the second breeding season. And so then you have multi-generational offspring there. And over time, those offspring will disperse out of their natal ranges or natal territories, but some of them will stay behind for multiple years and they'll contribute to pup rearing. And so this is how you get pack dynamics. This is why a lot of times you see in research why anthropogenic mortality, especially excessive mortality on wolves has a negative effect on pack dynamics, because the adults don't live long enough to have multiple years to raise multi-generational offspring. And so it disrupts the pack formations and destabilizes their social, I guess, structure within the population, and they struggle there. So take a step into what you're looking at here is a figure outlining from the Blackon era, I guess, or something. That's late Pliocene all the way up to late Bronto-Labrian period of the Pleistocene. This is just showing the size of the molar for canids that they found in this area. And so down here at the bottom, you can see one small canid size, or one size for the molar for a canid species, indicating that, in the southeastern U.S. and most of the eastern U.S., there was only one small coyote-sized animal down there. But as time went on, as you went into the early Pleistocene, those canids got bigger, indicating that there was a shift to a new species. And then suddenly up here, you have two different size molars with a big gap in size, indicating a small coyote-like animal in the east and a larger wolf-like animal. And eventually you have three, canids in the eastern U.S. by the late Pleistocene. And so by that time, you start to see these sort of modern canid populations becoming established. And what you're seeing here, this trend that things become larger over time, that's what we call the Cope's rule. So species tend to get bigger until they die out and they start all over again. And then these morphometric differences, like I mentioned, indicate different taxonomic groups there. And so what does that look like? It looks like this. These are just some photos or paintings or artwork that I've taken from some books. During that early Blanchan, I guess that's how you pronounce it, era, which is the late Pliocene, you start to see a Canis lineage, these lepophic animals. They're small jackal or coyote-like animals that are the sort of initial stage of canids evolving into Canis. And at some point, you get into the early Pleistocene, you get a coyote or wolf-like critter starting to appear in the east. And then eventually into the Pleistocene, you have a large wolf-like species there named Canis armbrusteri, I suppose. And these, they thought at the time, gave rise to Anacion dirus, which is the dire wolf. But that's not the case. Anacion dirus is now considered a different genus than the Canis. And so this Eurasian immigrant is now known not to have given rise to dire wolves. Dire wolves arose somewhere in South America, and then they made their way up to North America, and they were kind of a warm weather large wolf. That's why there's not many of them found in parts of like central and northern Canada. They're mostly in the U.S. and in Mexico and down into Central America, I suppose. And then by the time you got to the late Pleistocene, you have dire wolves, you have red wolves, and you have coyotes. And then with the mass extinction of megafauna, and then the immigration of humans into North America, the dire wolf went extinct. The gray wolf immigrated in with them, and eventually the red wolf, Canis rufus, becomes the predominant or the only Canis species in the eastern U.S. The smaller coyote eventually receded from the eastern U.S. and sort of had a range restricted to most of central and western North America and into Mexico. And they held that range until Europeans settled in North America and started disrupting things. So from that late terminal Pleistocene all the way up into human colonization or European colonization, red wolves coexisted with humans. So their numbers were stable. And Native Americans or indigenous peoples populated most of the eastern U.S. There were not a few of them. There was quite a bit of them prior to, as Europeans were settling. As you know, we spread disease, so many Native Americans unfortunately died because of that, and their numbers had decreased over time. And so as Europeans began settling areas, especially like in Appalachia and whatnot, most Native American communities are already decimated by that spread of disease. And so our estimates of Native American communities are quite underestimated, probably. But at any rate, these indigenous peoples across the eastern U.S. were considered to be an ecological drive. They drove a lot of the ecological they're an ecological force, what I have written there. Basically, the distribution of our forest and like, you know, pine forest, oak forest, and savannas was a result of their land practices. So, you know, Native Americans were very advanced in agriculture, even with medicine and whatnot. They were probably more advanced in America than Europeans were when they came. And so a lot of the fire and silviculture practices that those communities practiced across the eastern U.S. shaped, as I mentioned, the distribution of our oak and pine forest and whatnot. And it was done through sort of repeated and extensive burning, and then, of course, planting practices for trees. So a lot of, particularly in the Southeast, our systems are fire dependent. And looking at the historical trends of burns and fires, we see that the region was burned more often than what would have happened if it was just dependent on like lightning strikes. Lightning strikes happen seasonally in a small wet season, so most lightning strikes don't cause fires. But to have consistent burning year round by Native Americans really did shape the landscape, which would have been the landscape that red wolves sort of evolved on, right? Because the red wolf sort of emerged on the landscape in the late Pleistocene, and then sort of peaked in its geographic extent and probably population numbers with Native Americans up until Europeans started settling. And one of the reasons for that is because even though Native Americans have very heterogeneous perspectives on wildlife, overwhelmingly they have a positive view of wolves, and they consider wolves sacred, and they oftentimes consider them equal in terms of the value of their lives. Wolves play an important role in terms of how they explain the creation of the world, or, you know, whatever else for their myths and faith and whatnot. In the book here that I have highlighted here, it's a really good book that I read not too long ago. Professor, you know, Claudio Sant, you can see his name there. It covers why, at least in Alabama and Florida and other areas of the Southeast, why this landscape that was predominantly indigenous was converted over into a Euro-American landscape, and the effects that it had, mostly following the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the displacement of Native Americans to Oklahoma and Kansas and other territories out west. And then moving slavers into Alabama with their enslaved African populations to convert the landscape into large monocultures of like cotton and tobacco and whatnot, and the impact that had. And so, yeah, and so I would highly recommend this book here. It does do a really good job of explaining all that. And then, yeah, so here I want to just discuss that too. That book covers, you know, basically how Americans colonized Alabama, Florida, and other areas. But we had several European nations colonizing North America, and they did it under different ways. And so their interactions with wildlife vary quite a bit. And here, this book by Andrea Smalley is a great book too, Wild by Nature. I would suggest getting this. She covers the relationship that colonizers had with their wildlife and how it played a role in how they colonized areas. So like, the Spanish, when they began colonizing parts of North America, they weren't considering like settling areas. They just wanted to use these areas that they controlled for extractive purposes. They were just considering like, let's get the silver, let's get the gold to bring that back home so that we can finance our sort of national ambitions. And so they never wrote, I should say they never wrote, but they didn't have detailed descriptions of wildlife. The accounts that they have in their writings is mostly about the strangeness of wildlife. Like, these things are very abundant and they're different from what we see back home in Spain for these reasons. And so you don't get any really complex writing, I don't think. You get stuff like missionaries, priests, and other clergy just sort of reporting on what they're seeing out there and how they're interacting with them. The French had a different, I guess, mode or style or type of colonization because of where they colonized, mostly in Canada and parts of the U.S. Their goal was essentially fish and fur, and so their colonization was mostly an economic model. And so most of their interest and writings about wildlife focused on the interactions between Native Americans or indigenous peoples and wildlife, mostly because they relied heavily on Native Americans to harvest wildlife for fur or fish or whatnot, and then they traded with them, mostly guns and other types of equipment, I suppose. And so their relationship dictated how they wrote about wildlife. And then, of course, with English or the British, they're focused on settlement colonization. This colonization is about land and then converted it into like farms and townships, and it's just a constant spread out. It's not specific to, we want fur and fish, or we just want to extract gold and silver. It was about settling there and living there, building townships and building communities. And so when you see the British writings about wildlife, it's much more detailed when you see from what you see from the Spanish and French, because they're trying to describe how wildlife could assist settlement. So here are fruit and wildlife, or vegetation and wildlife, that could aid in surviving in this area versus types of things you should avoid and whatnot. And so over time, the British wound up, I think, providing some of the better details in natural histories in terms of writing than what other European nations did for that reason. So under English colonization, they wound up interacting with wolves in a number of ways: economic, political, legal, cultural, lots of contexts. And so the reason for that is because they were able to classify wildlife into basically two groups: groups that they want to eliminate and groups that they didn't. Basically things like beavers that provided fur, that had like an economic benefit for them. Of course, they liked those wildlife, and so they wrote positively about them, and they wanted to promote them. On the other hand, wolves that would eat livestock, black bears or grizzly bears or mountain lions and bobcats who did that too, not so much. And so they sort of focus on eliminating them. And the reason for this is because that red wolves and other wolf species would have affected their legal basis for settlement, how they sort of claim land. And so as an English settler or a British settler, you wanted to grab, say, 1,000 acres. The way you lay claim to that land legally was to make it productive. And the way you made it productive was to clear it of forest and then use it for agriculture, or you put livestock there. You put, I don't know, chickens, sheep, goats, pigs, and then having that type of agriculture there over a certain time period, you were able to make a legal claim to that land and say, this is mine, and you get deeded that land. So as you can imagine, if the wolves come onto that property and run your sheep off or your goats off, and you can't get your goats and sheep to stay there, they are basically erasing any legal claim that you have to that land. It's problematic because if you had that land, the wolves ran it off, and then your neighbor Bob put pigs out there who were better at staying on that property or land than the chickens were or whatever, they can make a legal claim and take that from you. And so this is one of the reasons why early colonists had sort of animosity towards wolves. So it's not just that, the Red Riding Hood and, things in the Bible and cultural stuff like that. There was actually a legal reason not to like wolves for this setup. And so one of the ways they handled that was through bounty laws. It's the most common law that we see in America. And it's just simple financial encouragement to go out there and kill wolves and other predators. What's funny about this, I shouldn't say funny, but it's something that you see here in the US today, this sort of rural to urban gradient and the different conflict that occurs on this, particularly between like urban areas and rural areas, and what to do about, stuff, just common political fighting. The same thing happened with colonists, right? Because in the East, where it was well developed, they didn't have wolves, they didn't have mountain lions, bears, they eradicated them. And so now you have other people on the frontier who are trying to settle areas that are dealing with these wildlife populations, predators, and they're asking for money to help do control. And where the money is on the East Coast side, I guess, where there's already been settled, and those folks don't want to pay the taxes. They don't want to see hike in taxes to do this predator control stuff and whatnot. And so it caused a lot of disputes among colonists over taxes and who's going to pay for it. It also raised the question of who's responsible for improving land. Is this an individual thing? Did Dave go out there and try to settle on 1,000 acres? Is he on his own completely? Or is it a collective responsibility? Should we be there to help Dave out? Because if Dave succeeds, then, it expands our colony and it provides, improvement for our lives or whatever. And so, so you look at these historical documents, you see lots of different debates then that you see occurring today. Very similar stuff. And so, yeah, so this is where Sonny and I and Colleen have been discussing like the importance of history. And I don't want to say human dimensions, but sociology or whatever, in terms of examining the red wolf's historical range, its persistence up until European colonization, how the species declined and where it's at today, and how to use this historical ecology and the socio-ecological research to sort of advance red wolf recovery efforts. I know there's two photos here. Let's look at one on the left here. What's in the hatched area is the red wolf's historical range across the eastern U.S. This area here, see the blue, that's where the current reintroduced population or peninsula. It's a 5-county area. Here in red is where the source population came from. That's Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas. And then here's Alabama. What you're seeing here is the remains of a wolf that is estimated, I want to say, to be about 2,500 years old. It's the Fern Cave specimen. So in northern Alabama, these cave dudes who were, how's it called, splunking or whatever, they were basically in a cave exploring it. They came across a fully formed like set of bones, basically the entire bones of a wolf. It had a baculum, so we know it's a male, and it turned out to be a red wolf. It's one of the oldest specimens we have of a red wolf. It's in Alabama. And as I mentioned, Alabama is rich with historical documentation for red wolves. And because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the focus of expelling Native Americans from Alabama to move white settlers in with their enslaved African populations, there's just lots of historical records there to monitor the red wolf and how it declined over time. And through that search, we are working with Amy Shutt with the Canid Project. She's the one who's finding a lot of these documents. This is an old photo of a young red wolf. You can see it right here that I'm circling, that was shot and killed by this family in Alabama back in 1911, and just put there. You can see it. So yeah, so lots of documentations to track this. And so here's another large black wolf that was shot in Alabama back in, I think this is 1911 too. This is a 17-year-old kid. So we're looking at, and this is sort of the conceptual framework that Sonny has put together for us to start working on. Basically looking at the values and orientations of the particular community, whether it's like Euro-Americans or Indigenous communities or diasporic Africans. The whole point here is, looking at this, the overall values that shape our attitudes and behaviors. Our attitude and behaviors then shape our institutions, how we do our economies, how we use our technology, and that forces us to interact with our wildlife and our land. And of course, these systems feed back into each other. So what I'm going to discuss here in a minute, basically, if you look back at the institution of slavery in Alabama, where we're looking at, that is a large value orientation that's community-wide that shapes particularly Euro-American or white Americans' attitudes and behaviors, which shapes their institutions and their economy, the institution of slavery, how that plays into the economy with cotton, tobacco, and then how that affects land and wildlife. In this case, you can see here from Unworthy Republic by Sant. On the left here, you can see the rich cotton or rich black prairie lands that were used for cotton. And over here is basically the spread of our enslaved African population from that time period. And you can see it corresponds with that directly. And underneath all this, you can see that there were Native Americans there. And as you can imagine, there's also our native wildlife populations and whatnot. And so this obviously had a big impact on everything, moving this type of colonization. And so we were able to dig through newspaper reports and other like books and other written records to look at basically where they were seeing red wolves. That's what you see here, these dots here, these are wolf sightings. This is basically the type of ecosystems that are out there, the interior plateau, Piedmont, Southwestern Appalachians, et cetera. And over here are the counties where they were developed, or I shouldn't say developed, but basically colonized and settled and then converted into agriculture. And you can see the counties here that are more white and light gray were the counties that were not as heavily, I guess, settled and converted into agriculture, and areas that were, you can see clearly the black belt where the cotton or where that black prairie came through, where most of the institution of slavery was established in Alabama is in that area there. And again, like I said, this is an ongoing project that we're using the red wolf as an example to look at this historical records and large sort of historical events that may have shaped our societies and how our societies interacted with wildlife and how that would have led to the eventual extinction of some of them, and particularly the extirpation of the red wolf from Alabama. And so since we're down there doing field work too, and the red wolf eventually was sort of a Gulf Coast animal that was, the last populations were down there. We are trying to look at the red wolf's legacy along the Gulf Coast. And there's a considerable amount of history that's been not really well explored by researchers. And so again, you're looking at the red wolf's historical range. If you're wondering why it doesn't stretch up into the Northeast, that last figure, this range right here is from a publication I did back in 2013. I had Fish and Wildlife Service members sort of co-authoring it with me. This is the Fish and Wildlife Service's official stance on the red wolf's historical range, even though some of us extended up into the Northeast. This is what they accept, and that's why it's different. As I mentioned, blue, reintroduced population, red is the source population. These are two wolves that were killed back, I think, in the 1930s, maybe 1920. This is definitely 1940s here. This one, I think, is a few decades beforehand. Big animals, clearly not coyotes. These aren't gray wolves. These are unique wolf species to the southeast, which is the red wolf. Just showing you that we have actual photographs of what was down there. Here's some more photographs of wolves being killed in particularly Louisiana. So by the 1900s, the red wolf was reduced to populations along the Mississippi River Basin in like southern Missouri, pushing down through Arkansas and whatnot into Mississippi, Louisiana, East Texas to the coast. In 1915, there was a federal law that was passed that the feds finally sort of jumped into predator control and started financing it. And there was a ramp up in there. And so they started massive killing campaigns or eradication campaigns. And so the red wolf got hit hard during that period. And so from like 1915 until like 1950, their range around, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, up into Arkansas, Missouri got reduced down to, a handful of counties in Southeast Texas and a handful of parishes in Louisiana. Louisiana is interesting because Louisiana was the last stronghold for red wolves in the 1960s, largely because they got into the game late in terms of requesting federal funding, I think, for these predator control campaigns. And so what you're seeing here is a map of Louisiana. Let me see what the next thing is. Yeah. So this is, like I said, Louisiana was the last stronghold. Edwards Plateau in Texas is basically south central Texas. That is where the initial hybrid swarm started with red wolf and coyotes. Basically, the initial predator control program started out there around 1915, 1920. They disrupted the canid populations out there. The last remaining red wolves started outbreeding with coyotes. And so you had this large swarm of red wolves, coyotes, and red wolf coyote hybrids, with the hybrids outnumbering both the parental species. And as predator control programs got initiated and moved east, that hybrid swarm sort of followed with it into East Texas and eventually to Louisiana. At that point, I'm gonna pull these slides up. Yeah. At that point in Louisiana, there were 4 wolf populations. You had one in the Northeast, one down here in the central area, and one in the Southwest. And they also had one up here in the Northwest. But that was the first wolf population to get extirpated, which opened up the door for coyotes to start moving into Louisiana. Eventually, this population up in Tinsall River was snuffed. These wolves down here, this population was extirpated too, and that allowed the coyotes to start moving east through Louisiana into Mississippi, then Alabama and Florida and so on. This population down here in Cameron Parish and Calcasieu, it was also in Southeast Texas across the Sabine River there. It stayed there and it persisted into the 1960s. And that's what caught a lot of people's attention. They realized everywhere else, the red wolf was either gone or being replaced by the coyote, except for that area. And so in 1973, with the passage of the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service created the Red Wolf Recovery Program. The recovery program went into that area of Southeast Texas and Louisiana and did extensive field work to sort of assess the population to figure out whether or not it was going to be extirpated at some point, and they concluded that it was not going to last that long. And so they started running trap lines to catch as many canids as they could to see if they could find the last remaining sort of red wolves that they knew about, so they can put them into a captive breeding program, so that they could sort of save the species from extinction. And they captured 62 wolves. And then after 1980, they weren't catching any more, so they declared the red wolf extinct. Of those 62 wolves, I think 40 of them were shipped up to Point Defiance Zoo in Tacoma, and out of those 40, I guess about 17, either survived or proved to be wolves or something like that, and then 14 wound up breeding, which is where we they wound up being the progenitors or the founders for our current population of about 290 in captivity and about the 20 or so that are in the wild. And of course, that captive population, once it reached about 100 individuals in the mid-80s, they used some of those animals to begin the initial reintroduction efforts in North Carolina. And then in 1992, they tried a reintroduction project in the Great Smokies Mountains National Park. Of course, the one in the Smokies failed. It was terminated in 96, and the one in North Carolina is still going. So yeah, and so that's where we're at now with the red wolf. But what we're interested in the Gulf Coast is that we want to go back there and reevaluate the area to see if there's anything going on down there in terms of the red wolf's legacy. Lots of hybridization occurred down there. There's always been reports of large canids that have been killed down there or trapped or whatnot. Some people think there's still wolves down there. And so what we're doing is reevaluating that trap line data. And so you can see here on this map, this is Houston right here. So this is Southeast Texas, and over here is Southwest Louisiana. These red dots represent all the red wolves that they were able to capture during 1974 to 1980. What you see here, 74001, is the very first animal they caught in 1974 when they initiated the trap lines. This is the processing sheet. This is the first wolf that they caught. This is, I think, Mr. Sabine. He was shipped off to Point Defiance Zoo and was the first founder. He was caught right here where my dot is, right there, right outside Port Arthur near Sabine Pass. This right here is Texas Point National Wildlife Refuge. So that's where he was caught in 74. These blue dots here represent the coyotes that they caught on the trap line. And these photos are other photos of wolves that they had captured. Some of these animals in these cages here were clearly being shipped off and moved up to Point Defiance Zoo. So these are potentially some of the founders for the current population that we have. And then what's in brown here are the hybrids that they caught. And here, this is when they were doing, these are photos of when they were capturing red wolves in the Johnson Bayou area of Southwest Louisiana here. They couldn't run their trap lines into the swamps. It was too difficult. So they did aerial netting. And that's what's happening here. They netted this wolf in the water and then they brought it back out. The last red wolf that was caught out there was in 1980. They radio marked that animal and released it. But the last founder that was caught, I don't know if it was on the Louisiana or Texas side. It was in here. It was in 1979. So the last founder out there was called, 1979. And so about 2-3 years ago, we were funded to do a project down there to reassess that population. And this is what this project we worked on is called the Gulf Coast Canine Project. And like I said, our primary objective was just to go down there, assess the taxonomy of what those animals are. Are they wolves? Are they coyotes? Are they something in between? And a lot of that involved us live trapping animals and taking morphometric data and genetic data off them and then putting radio collars on them to track them. And so we published, and so that mostly focused in, like I said, this southwestern part of the state. These are 4 areas that I trapped. And so, so in relation to where they did their historical trapping, what I caught is in green here. These are all the animals that I caught out there. And so we weren't exactly in where those trap lines were ran, mostly because this area here was done with helicopters. It's all wet. I couldn't get in there with a truck. So I wound up trapping around Sabine National Wildlife Refuge and some of the private lands there. And these are some of the animals that we caught, radio marked and released. And so we published a paper a couple of years ago where we found that that these animals did have a lot of sort of red wolf genetics in them. And they did have some appearances that made them look wolf-like. This is one of our wolves from the Wolf Conservation Center. This is like a big 80-pound male. This guy right here is like a 44-pound male, but they look big because they're bigger than your typical Eastern coyote, but they're not anywhere near as big as a red wolf. They're not that large, but they do have a lot of red wolf ancestry in them. And so we are seeing that for an animal that went extinct more than 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, that these animals out there have a lot of red wolf ancestry in them. So, that's what's curious. When we went out there, we were expecting to find maybe 5 or 10% red wolf ancestry in them, and we were finding some animals with as much as 70% red wolf ancestry in them, and many of them being at least a quarter to half red wolf. And so there's a lot of red wolf genetics in those animals out there that are sort of influencing their morphology and probably their behavior and ecology. And so that's what we were looking at too, looking at their body measurements and stuff. These are right here. These three are coyotes, coyotes from North Carolina, coyotes from Southwest Louisiana, and coyotes from Galveston Island. And you can see they all clump together in their body mass, their shoulder height, and their hind foot length. But then when you get to our Gulf Coast canids, these animals that we're handling in Southwest Louisiana, they're on par with the hybrids from North Carolina and slightly smaller than the hybrids that were caught in the 1974 to 1980 trap line. But they are on par with confirmed hybrids in North Carolina in terms of their body mass, their shoulder height, and their hind foot length. But they are much smaller than the wolves in North Carolina and the wolves that were caught in Southwest Louisiana during the 1970s and 1980s in terms of their body mass, shoulder height, and their hind foot length. Where it gets kind of weird is that their head sizes are much smaller than our hybrids and even the coyotes. They just have smaller heads out there. And the head measurements is kind of odd. And so collectively, I guess, with all the body measurements, if you were handling this animal and you had it on the table to compare to a red wolf, it is much smaller than a red wolf. Its head's smaller, but they're long-legged, so they can be almost as tall as a red wolf and maybe as long as one, but their heads are tiny. So they're big shouldered, they got long legs, and they're just sort of weird looking when compared to a coyote or a red wolf. And most of that's probably because they're in a marsh or a swamp area. And so the sort of wetland habitats, probably the red wolf genetics is being used to improve their height so they can move through that kind of landscape. So they're not eating a lot of deer, as you'll see in a minute. So there's no need to allocate the red wolf ancestry in a way that would benefit through bigger head sizes because they're not killing large prey. They're actually eating nutria and small mammals. So that increase in body size is really beneficial to just sort of move through that wetland complex out there. And so comparing them to red wolves, and you can see that the red wolf has a much longer head. So your typical red wolf head is like in length, it's probably about 22 to 23 centimeters centimeters long, with some of the larger heads being like 26, 25, some of the smaller ones being about 21. For Gulf Coast canids, the length of their skull or head is like 20 at tops centimeters, with the smaller ones being about 17. So they have a tiny head. But if you look at them from a distance in a field, this is a female wolf, this is a male Gulf Coast canid, they can look a lot like wolves, which is why people confuse them and think they're wolves at times. But once you have them in hand, clearly not. I mean, this is a 38-pound male. This is a 78-pound male from North Carolina. This is a female. She's got big ears. She kind of looks wolfish. Again, she's like 32, 34 pounds, very long-legged, very tall. Very thin and I guess lanky. And this is a heavy set, like another 79-pound male. The wolves are just much, much bigger than these animals are. Not wolves, clearly. So we've been collecting movement data. So this is one of our animals that we cut loose with a radio collar on it. This male, Louisiana 9, this is his natal home range. He was a young juvenile, and so he made some excursions up and came back. So this is his predispersal area. Eventually he stepped off and became a transient. He's moving around this landscape and eventually settles in here for about 8-9 months before he dies. I think he was hit on the road there. His collar was found in with his carcass, and we couldn't confirm cause of death. But as I mentioned before, this is a very wet environment. You can see where they're trying to move across areas that are inundated with water. They're using old oil, I guess, road panel or oil well roads or panels or whatever, pads, sorry. And they're crossing canals and ditches and stuff like that. So that long-leggedness for them to be able to navigate out there. It's better to be tall and have good chest and upper body strength to swim across than it is to be short-legged and not have that. Here on the FR Ranch, this is an area that's not hunted. It's got cattle, very restricted access. We have a pack there that's well documented now, the Southeast Odom pack. The red dots that are underneath the yellow and green ones are dictating the red line here, which is the home range that's the breeding female. The yellow dots is her predispersing male. And at some point that male winds up leaving, which represents by the green dots, and eventually his collar fails. What this is showing is that, yeah, they come out, they hit this intercoastal waterway, they come back, they make these excursions, and eventually they just sort of step off and they start bouncing around and get across stuff. And unfortunately, our collars, the batteries don't last that long after a while, and the collars shut down. But just sort of the kind of movements that we're seeing out there. Their home range sizes is not big. You're talking maybe 10 for the residents. Predispersers a little bit more because they're making excursions, so about 10 square kilometers. That's really small and on par with home range sizes for coyotes. Your red wolves in North Carolina, their average home range sizes are about 76 square kilometers, which is about the size of the area that transients use out here. So that would be about this. This area here would be a red wolf home range as opposed to these smaller ones that they're using. So wolves are bigger and they require bigger areas to maintain their packs. So again, body size and morphometrics, very coyote-like, movements, very coyote-like, but they still have some red wolf genetics in them. And of course, their diet. So these are photos from the FR Ranch. This cow was not killed by the canids. It died on its own. I think she laid in a ditch or something and just passed away in natural causes. Anyway, they left the carcasses out there for the animals, and they foraged on it. What you see here, GCCP, is the Gulf Coast Canid Project. TRNWR is Tinsall River National Wildlife Refuge, and Tri-State is our Tri-State Project in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, which is why it's called the Tri-State Project. These two here, Tinsall River and the Tri-State, we published these data on diet a couple of years ago. GCP is the diet data we have from a handful of packs in that area, Southwest Louisiana. As you can see, white-tailed deer is actually common in coyote diets outside this area. We only found one scat that had any remains of white-tailed deer in it. Outside that, none of the scats had deer in it. The rest of the area here, they had lots of pig in it, not lots, but some pig in it, lots of nutria, rabbit, and small mammals. Where they differ is their use of pig and nutria. Tons of nutria in their diet, lots of small mammals, and then of course pig. And coyotes outside this area are not eating a whole lot of pig or nutria. Mostly feeding on deer, rabbit, and small mammals with some use of fruit. We don't see use of fruit with our animals either. And then comparing among our sites there, what we're seeing is that as you leave the wetland areas and get into agriculture, you start to see a shift from pig to rabbit and small mammals, and a shift from nutria, obviously. So like on the FR Ranch, you see quite a use of pig because there's lots of pigs there. But once you get on the Sabine and Apache Corps land that's closer to the coast, you start seeing an increase in nutria. There's just a lot more nutria available for them. So they are using what's available. But that use of pig is interesting because you would think that the pig use is due to scavenging, but that's not the case. We're seeing a lot of times that they're actually moving around with piglets. So it seems to be that they are hitting young piglets and actually predating on pigs at times, though they are scavenging adults that are killed during like pig control roundups and stuff like that. In terms of survival, their survival is really good. Here at 300, this is 300 days. If you go to the left to the X or the Y axis here, it's at like 82%. So that means by the time you get to the end of the year, you have 82% of the animals surviving, which is like 4 out of 5. So that's very high survival for coyotes, because when you look at elsewhere, survival at 365 days is around 50%. And in areas of South Carolina, Alabama, and Texas, at different study sites, we had like 6 study sites, and the survival for those coyotes range from like 35% to 65%, which is why you have an average of about 50%. So the survival out here for coyotes is high, and it probably explains why red wolves persisted out there for so long and why that red wolf ancestry is still there. And what's also pretty amazing is that the survival for transients is really high. These are animals that are not tied down to a pack. They're moving across the landscape solitary. They're solitary animals moving across the landscape. So they're crossing lots of roads. They're moving across a lot of different properties, probably hitting trap lines or hitting properties that are being managed for hunting. So they're crossing hunting towers and stuff like that. Lots of opportunities to be killed. And overwhelmingly, they're surviving. And so we just have very, very high survival out there, which is good news. That's why the ancestry is persisting. There's not a whole lot of turnover. If there's a lot of turnover, these animals would be washed off the landscape, and Western coyotes would sort of move in and occupy that area, and you would see a lot more coyote genetics out there. So the genetics are a consequence of high survival. They are not a reason for high survival. They are a consequence of it. And so some of the conclusions that I've drawn off this project is that, these animals are somewhat different from coyotes, but they're definitely not wolves. And we have been calling them Gulf Coast canids for that reason. They are restricted to the Gulf Coast, particularly, the marshland complex along the coastal prairies there along the coast. And so we feel like that's a more accurate name for them. Their high survival is what's retaining that ancestry out there. And it's a similar survival rate that we see on Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada, where they have eastern wolves. They've been able to provide protective laws and regulations for those populations up there. And so they have high survival for the eastern wolves. As a result, you have pack dynamics, and you have very little coyote presence in a PP because the wolves keep them out. And that high survival, I think, is around 80 or 85%, which is on par with what we're seeing down in Cameron Parish and Jefferson Davis Parish down there in Southwest Louisiana, which could be informative for North Carolina. If I recall correctly, the survival for red wolves in North Carolina is high 60s, low 70s. And so if they want to, maintain good pack dynamics on the AP, they're probably going to need survival rates of above 80. The diet's unique. There's no deer in their diet. That's good, I guess, for these animals because they're not causing any conflict with hunters or landowners who are managing the land for hunting. But it's also because the area has very low deer density. There's not a whole lot of deer out there. And so they're utilizing nutrient and peg and whatnot. So they have a very unique diet. And their phenotype is very unique. As I mentioned, tall, lanky, lots of variation, but they have tiny heads and large ears. And I think that kind of gives them a weird look. I don't know. This one looks wolfish, but it's way smaller than a wolf. It has a small head, but it just looks bigger for whatever reason. And so there's something else going on there that I'm not at least capturing with my morphometric data. It might be a different way I need to measure it. So where are we going with this project now? What we're doing is bringing in a graduate student, Tanner Broussard. He's a McNeese State University student. Sorry, guys. He comes from a long line of family out there that are ranchers. And this newspaper article here, I think this is his uncle who caught a red wolf out there and had it mounted. And so the Broussards do a lot of work across that county or parish, and they have a lot of history with the other ranchers out there. And so that provides us, basically a connection with the community doing this research, and we can maintain some continuity with the families that had helped out the recovery program 40, 50 years ago in terms of giving them access to the ranches and assisting trapping animals and stuff like that. So going forward, we kind of want to double down in this area here, move our trapping efforts into this western part of the parish to ensure that we can get in these areas where the wolves were caught, 30, 40 years ago, and try to catch some animals in there, and then come over to basically Chambers in Jefferson County over here in Texas and start trapping and working off the refuges there on these ranches where those animals were caught too, and start continuing what we were doing there, and see what else we can find out down there. And then going forward, just pause here. It's just using this research and other projects we're doing now to sort of reinvigorate red wolf recovery efforts. This is the final thing I'll just cover here quickly. I know we're running out of time. The primary goals here for us with the research lab for red wolves and red wolf recovery in North Carolina and any potential future site is basically to coalesce enough research, good science that can be used by the Fish and Wildlife Service to support their decisions. The recovery program has a recovery plan for red wolves, but then they also come up with this recovery implementation strategy that lays out important, I guess, action items that they have to do for red wolves. Those action items are very specific. They could be anything from like developing a pedigree to monitor the wild population for genetic integrity, sterilization programs for coyotes to prevent hybridization, ways to mitigate human-caused mortality, whether that's finding ways to improve survival along roadways or working with landowners to ensure that they aren't being shot or trapped to death. And they come with timelines and estimated costs. So they're very specific. And knowing these things, it could help gear our research to say, okay, well, let's take these action items or these particular things that you have to do, and we can provide you the science to sort of support decisions you use going forward. The best way to do that right now is that we do have a lot of existing data set from the past 30 years that the program's been out there, including our ability to collect new data. So we want to coalesce, important ecological data sets, social data sets, and management data sets to sort of assist in this way. And then we can use sort of spatially explicit modeling to help understand things like red wolf and coyote ecology, how people tolerate red wolves, and then how we can manage for red wolves and coyotes. And what that means is like, we can do a project on, assessing diet and say that, red wolves, 72% of their diet is white-tailed deer, but but they don't, not all wolves eat 70%, 72% white-tailed deer. That diet is going to vary quite a bit from pack to pack, and it's going to be influenced by the habitat they're in. And so one pack may eat more whitetail than the other one does, and knowing how that variation is spread out in the landscape is important. Being able to create these spatially explicit maps for that can help management. The other thing that's important here is that that successful research and successful recovery efforts then could be used. This could set up a template to be used for other large carnivores elsewhere. And that's already been done with red wolf recovery. Red wolf recovery happened in the reintroduction happened in 1987. Gray wolf reintroductions in Yellowstone occurred in 95. So the red wolf served as a template and a learning experience for Fish and Wildlife Service to do the reintroductions in Yellowstone. And so the red wolf's been a leader in that capacity. Here's a spatially explicit map that I refer to. This is from a paper that I published, I feel like 10 years ago. This is looking at the probability of habitat use for red wolves. This is based on red wolves that we had radio marked out there, and I could do location data and correlate that with types of land cover. And this is a red wolf here from the Tyson pack on a refuge road. So the probability of you encountering a red wolf is high in areas where it's red, pretty decent in areas where it's yellow, and almost zero in areas where it's blue. It's just poor habitat there. You're just not going to see a wolf or a coyote there. So this guy right here, I got a photograph of this guy in this area of the refuge, coming across down like a refuge road up here. Up this way towards Tyson. And so he was in this red yellow area. And so this is how we figure out like the type of habitats are useful to them. So all these dark, large red areas are going to be good for packs. It's going to be good for eating, lots of deer, stuff like that, food resources, and of course, where they're going to whelp pups. Now, if you were to look at a spatially explicit map for mortality, you would have to correlate red wolf deaths with land cover types, and then you'd create a heat map like this showing areas where they have high risk of dying, whether to gunshot mortality or being hit by a car or natural through intraspecific strife, fighting among different packs and stuff like that. And so you get to mortality. This is a figure showing monthly survival rates for red wolves. And what you can see here is during October through December, you see mortality drops quite a bit. That ties into the hunting seasons, white-tailed deer and black bear for North Carolina, at least that area, North Carolina. So shooting deaths are most common during this time of the year, at least when I published this data a few years ago. Now, roadkill is the most common form of death for red wolves because there's so few of them out there. The current pack that's supporting most of the population is near Highway 64. At any rate, this is occurring during the pair bonding time of the year, right before they start breeding. And so packs are being disrupted. And of course, most red wolves at that time, at least 70% of them were dying before the age of 4. And so this all discourages pack dynamics. And like what they saw in Ontario with the Eastern wolf, when you discourage pack dynamics, you have a lot of wolves dying young. It facilitates coyote encroachment into the area, and the solitary surviving wolves start interacting with those coyotes, and some of them wind up pairing up with them and hybridizing with them. And so this is where hybridization is not natural. Hybridization is pretty much facilitated by anthropogenic killing. If you just leave the wolves alone, they'll find other wolves, they'll pair up with them, they'll maintain territories, they'll grow their packs, they'll have good defensive areas, and they'll keep coyotes out. It's when you start trapping and shooting them and start removing wolves that it gives the coyotes an advantage. It allows them to come in, encroach in the areas and have numerically superior numbers, and they can sort of push out, solitary animals and whatnot. And so, of course, this ties into social tolerance. This is not an issue of having less prey or poor habitat. This is a problem of having people being intolerant or not tolerant of wolves. And so what we're doing here is we surveyed 72 counties across the red wolf's historical range. That's what you see in pink. And we are correlating their support for red wolf reintroductions or for red wolves in general with things like education, income level, the percentage of urbanization in those counties, how much of that county's livestock or farming, agriculture, basically, their voting preferences and whatnot. And once we can correlate support for those factors or those demographics, then we can look at those areas in white, those counties that we haven't sampled, and then we can use this information here to estimate support for the surrounding areas that we didn't sample. And like what you saw for the heat map for red wolf use, in this case, it's going to be a heat map for social tolerance. And here's some of our collaborators for that project: Jerry Bruscotter, John Vucetich, Ricky Burrell, Neil Carter, and Mark Elbrock. So it's a big group that we're working with from different institutions. So some of the issues that we have in North Carolina and other areas where wolves are being harvested, this is the management side, is knowing how people hunt. So this is what's happening: is a wolf would be coming down this area here, moving, and somebody would be in this hunting tower looking out. And when they see a wolf or a coyote, they'll shoot it. A lot of times they can shoot an animal from 300-400 yards away. So they don't have to be very close to the animal. They just need to see it and shoot it. And so these things are peppered throughout the AP. And these things are in wolf territories. And this is how they're getting themselves shot out there. These areas are baited. So here's a bait station where they can drop corn and draw in deer and pig or whatever. And here's a food plot designed to bring in deer and wild turkeys. So as you see, they're aggregating in the prey, the wolves come in, and then the hunters will be in these hunting towers. And of course, if they see a wolf or a coyote, they shoot it. So that's how wolves are dying in North Carolina. And so knowing these characteristics on the landscape will help us figure out where wolves are most likely to die, and then how Fish and Wildlife Service can reach out to the landowners or these hunting clubs and coordinate with them to get them to stop shooting wolves and do better management. The other thing too here to finish up is this partner preferences study in red wolves. We want to look at red wolf mating behaviors and figure out like how do they assertively mate, and then of course in captivity, how can you improve reproduction to grow and expand the captive population. So we're tag teaming with Utah State University. So Julie Young is out there. This is the USDA coyote captive facility out there that she ran for like 15 years. So she's done this work out there with coyotes, and our graduate student who's studying under her is Lovin. They're out there now. And so they have focused. I mean, Julie's background is in this list of stuff here that she's studied at this facility in terms of coyote breeding behaviors and whatnot. And so our job here is to do that with the captive animals. So we want to look at captive animals in the safe facilities, the safe population, and then sort of build an ethogram and look at behaviors and then correlate behaviors with pair bonding success. So when they put two wolves together, we can monitor their behaviors to see if they accept each other. If they do accept each other, do they hang out with each other? Are they friendly with each other? How often do they try to copulate? How often do they tie? Once they do tie, then is she pregnant? If she is pregnant, does she whelp? And if she does whelp, how many pups does she have? So litter size, and then how they interact with those pups, how they take care of them, and then how many of those pups wind up surviving. So then we can correlate behavior with things with like, pair bonding success, reproductive success, and then like offspring survival. Now, some of these wolves are going to be selected to go into the wild. And so then they're moved to North Carolina to a acclimation pen. And the way they've been doing it out there now is they go grab a wild wolf that they want to pair up with a captive animal, and they put them together in a pen. So this gives us an opportunity to compare a captive born animal raised in a captive setting by humans and paired up with a wild wolf to compare their behaviors, because obviously some of these animals that are being raised in captivity are probably somewhat habituated to humans. And so this allows us to figure out what behaviors differ between the two. And the ones that differ, that are sort of what the captive animals are doing, are probably human learned behaviors or habituated behaviors. And so once we learn those, once the animal's released into the wild, it's either going to succeed in maintaining that pair that we wanted it to form, and it's going to establish a territory, breed, and raise pups, or it's not. It's going to wind up getting itself killed, or it's going to wind up getting itself in trouble, and it's going to be recaptured and moved back to the captive setting. So in this case, we can then correlate failures of translocations with husbandry practices, facility conditions, and whatnot, so that we can refine our criteria for selecting animals for release into the wild. Since the population is about 20 right now, they're going to be heavily dependent on moving adult-sized animals that have been raised in captive settings to the wild. And it's important that if you select 5 animals, that all 5 animals don't get killed in the wild, that at least 2 or 3 of them successfully pair bond with other wolves and start raising wild-born pups. And at some point, you're relying less on the captive population to grow the wild population. And I think that's it. Yeah, I know I went over about 15 minutes. I appreciate you guys hanging on for that length of time. This is not a red wolf. This is a coyote from the FR Ranch. It's one of those Gulf Coast canids. At any rate, I'll take some questions. Thanks for hanging in there for like 65 minutes or whatever it was.
Thanks so much, Joey. Always so interesting and informative. We do have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I think just to jump in, I know you touched on it during the presentation, but there have been several questions about the canids on Galveston Island and the various terminology that's been used. I guess in kind of like a quick summary, what would you classify those canids as? And are they eligible for Endangered Species Act protections?
So all the canids along the Gulf Coast, including the ones in Galveston Island, are coyotes. They're all coyotes. We haven't encountered anything that is that approach the red wolf. Now they do have red wolf ancestry in them, and the ancestry there is being considered important because it's ancestry that was lost to the safe population that we have in captivity and the few animals that we have in North Carolina. Basically, the red wolves went through a bottleneck. And so there was hundreds of animals across the coast, and they had, X amount of genetic diversity. When you go in there, you grab 17 and you move them up to 40 or whatever it was, and you only get 14 to breed up in Point Defiance Zoo. You reduce the genetic variation, I don't know, by half or something like that. It's a lot less than X that's along the coast at the time. And normally that genetic ancestry would be lost forever. Like you wouldn't see it because those animals would have died out and they would have taken that variation with them. But because they were outbreeding with coyotes, that genetic variation was moved into the coyote genome along that coast there. And so that's where you get this lost genetic variation that you don't see in the current red wolf population. A good example of that is melanism. So the genetics that code for black coat color is completely extinct in red wolf. We don't have black red wolves anymore. We used to have them all over the place along the Southeast. The early settlers wrote about the black American red wolf that they saw in Florida and Georgia and whatnot. But coyotes come in, they're melanistic coyotes, and they got that from outbreeding with red wolves in the Southeast. They acquired those genetics and they retain that genetic variation that gives them that black coat color. It's been lost in the red wolf because of the population bottleneck. Now, geneticists, when they're publishing papers and stuff like that, they come up with cute terminology to sort of help promote and sell their papers to get people to cite it and whatnot. And so they refer to this as like ghost alleles or ghost genetics or something like that. But what you're talking about is just lost genetic variation due to the bottleneck. And so when you hear terms like ghost wolves, that's where they're getting at. I don't support that terminology. And I know the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state agencies that are like TPWD and Louisiana Division of Fish and Wildlife don't support that. They prefer you to refer to the animals as Gulf Coast canids or coyotes. So they wouldn't be eligible for any protection under the ESA because they're not wolves. They're not red wolves. They're still coyotes. And as I mentioned, there's high survival out there, and that's what's retained in the ancestry. So the fact that you have high ancestry values out there means that the landscape is safe enough for them anyway to persist. And so I don't know if I've answered everything there for that question.
Yeah, no, that was a great response, Joey. Thank you. And to follow up regarding those coastal canids, what do you think could best explain the high relative survival of the southern coastal canids?
The high survival is due to their isolation. A lot of those areas, it's just low road density. It's ranches that are gated. There's a lot of oil leases out there, like south of Sabine. There's a big swath of land between the Gulf and Sabine National Wildlife Refuge that's managed for oil leases. And so that's all gated, and only certain folks can get in there to access those oil wells and do work. So it's very extractive. So the lack of access is important. And then because of the low deer density that's down there, you don't get a ton of deer hunting. So most of the hunting down there is waterfowl hunting. And so folks are on boats in deep areas of the water canals and whatnot, doing fishing or hunting waterfowl. And so a lot of that has to do with the high survival. That's why as you come out of that marsh complex and you get into more agricultural areas where you have livestock or you have like timber harvesting and stuff like that, where those properties are leased for hunting, you start to see an increase in human-caused mortality with the coyotes, and you get less red wolf ancestry in those animals because they're being removed from the landscape at a higher rate, which means they have to be replaced by immigrants. And since there's no red wolf populations around, they're being replaced by coyotes. And that's how the coyote ancestry sort of takes over and the red wolf ancestry gets washed out.
Got it. And a question about the Smokies. Why did the reintroduction effort there, quote, fail, or why was it halted? And then what happened to the wolves that were part of that effort?
Yeah, so the Smokies started in 92. They had put a couple pairs out in Cades Cove and they persisted for like, I don't know, like 12 months. And since they stayed out in Cades Cove for that long, they were like, this is probably good to go. And so they started releasing wolves in the Smokies. The problem was that they didn't realize that it was really poor habitat and that the wolves would want to leave the National Park Service land to adjacent lands that were either private or publicly owned by, like, the Department of Forestry and whatnot, because the recovery program didn't have MOUs established with the surrounding landowners. Anytime a wolf left the Park Service land, they had to go catch it and bring it back. And there was constant movement of wolves off the service land, and then they had to catch and bring it back. They did that for like 5-6 years. It just wasn't feasible. On top of that, because the habitat quality was so low, I guess they weren't able to raise pups. The few packs that did establish themselves in Cades Cove, and I think the Tremont area or whatever it's called, they would produce pups, but then the pups weren't surviving. So they didn't know why the pups were dying. They clearly had, like, wolves drop 6 pups. They would see the pups age into like 8, 9, 10 weeks, and they would just disappear. So they thought it might have been an issue of parvo or something like that. So the combination of low reproduction, and low reproduction means zero reproduction, and then of course leaving constantly, they just decided it wasn't feasible. They couldn't do that forever, and so they just terminated the project. Regarding the animals that were out there, they just recaptured them, and then they put them back into safe, and then they moved some of them to North Carolina. So some of the animals were released back into North Carolina and became breeders themselves and contributed to the population out there. And one interesting fact, I don't know if this is going to be a question, I doubt it, but the pup fostering technique was first used in the Smokies project, at least my understanding from what Chris told me. Chris Lukash is no longer alive, so I can't verify this with him, but he had told me that in the Smokies, they had caught a male that was leaving the Park Service land. They needed a space to put him. They had some holding facilities there, some space. They didn't have any space there to put him with. They were preoccupied with other animals. So they put him with an old female that was like 12 years old or something for just a day or two. They didn't think they would tie. And so they shipped him out to a zoo or something like that, not realizing that he did in fact tie with her. And a few months later, she was pregnant. And she gave birth to a couple pups. And when she was in the process of, I guess, giving birth, she died. And so they had, I think, 2 pups or something like that they didn't know what to do with. That they were, shit, what do we do with this? And then the idea came up, well, why don't we just go out to Cades Cove and just slip them into a litter and see if they take? And they did that, and they took. So I don't know what the litter size was for the wild one, maybe it was 4. So they put 2 in there. They got 6 animals. And so they'd go out there a week or 2 later and check, and there were still 6 animals. And they check again 6, 7 weeks, and there were still 6 animals. So they knew the pups were adopted and survived. And then like at week 10, they didn't see any of the pups. And so all the pups wound up dying in that litter. And so when the project was terminated, and when Chris came back to North Carolina in like 98 or whatever it was, clearly he brought that knowledge back with him. And then they started discussing pup fostering and stuff like that in North Carolina. And eventually it was done. I think the first one was a wild transfer in 2000 or 2001. And then when I was out there in 2002, the first pup fostering happened in the Tyson pack, and I was an intern there. They called them the CNN pups. So they put the 2 pups there, and I was on that litter monitoring them. Both of the pups survived. And that was the first time that technique was used in North Carolina with captive animals. So anyway, long rant, but that's where the pup fostering, as far as I know, came from. The idea of it.
Amazing. And just a reminder for folks, pup fostering is also used with the Mexican wolf program. So Joey had mentioned the red wolf program was a model for other wolf reintroductions in the US with adults, and also with pups as well. So very interesting information to have. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask maybe 2 more questions. And I apologize to folks. We had so many questions. I'll put the lab page in the chat. So if folks do have additional questions, they can always reach out to Joey and the research team via the website. But why is there the dispute about the historic range of red wolves? What might be the logic behind the Fish and Wildlife Service recognizing the smaller range that you had showed on the map?
Oh, so there's no dispute. I don't think it's not a hill anybody's going to die on. So the red wolf's historic range, if you go back to like 1970 or whatever, when they started doing this, they thought it was much more restricted to the Gulf Coast and maybe pushed into like North Carolina and the surrounding areas like Tennessee and whatnot. Over time, as Ron Nowak worked with historical specimens that were, I guess, extracted or what are excavated, he wound up finding red wolf specimens in Pennsylvania and then in Maine. So Ron, based on historical specimens, basically has that larger range that includes the Northeast. Because of the animal's ecology and the way it's tied to deciduous forests, when the Fish and Wildlife Service assessed their historical range, they used environmental factors and habitat needs and stuff like that to help refine the red wolf's historical range. So if you look at their extent, it ties into the distribution of deciduous forests. So as you go into New England, deciduous forests sort of break down and they transition into boreal forest. And that's where they think that, in this case, eastern wolves probably would have occurred, or gray wolves. But we don't have any record of gray wolves, I don't think, in the Northeast. So either the red wolf occupied the Northeast, or it was the eastern wolf that occupied the Northeast. And depending who you talk to, that's a whole nother topic or rabbit hole to go into, or whatever, is whether or not the eastern wolf and the red wolf are the same thing. So anyway, that's it. It's not something that's highly disputed, but it's just a difference. It'll get fixed at some point.
Wonderful. Thanks for clarifying, Joey.
Yeah,
and I think last question we'll ask live. I will say there were several questions regarding book suggestions you would have about red wolves, but I wonder that might be easier, maybe even to post on the webinar page when we post the recording. That might be good to give the research team time to kind of consolidate their recommendations for future readings. But last question, is it possible that there are more genuine, quote, true red wolves out there, or is it more likely that they're pretty much all hybrids outside of the North Carolina recovery area?
For now, I would say there's a slim chance that there's anything out there. I think the area that we're looking in, because it was so heavily trapped by the Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of those animals were removed due to depredation complaints and whatnot. They probably, that area is probably very, very slim chance that there's anything out there that could be considered a red wolf. There could be other isolated areas outside that zone that they trapped heavily, maybe further west along the Texas coast, that could be harboring bigger animals that could be red wolf-like. I wouldn't call them, it's hard to say. I mean, you would think if animals were large and persisting, and people are shooting and harvesting them, they would turn them in into contests and be like, look, we caught this large 82-pound animal, there's 72-pound animal. And to my knowledge, nothing's turned up like that yet. But that's not to say there may not be. But for now, I think it's a very slim chance of us finding something that would be a big red wolf out there. Is that
Wonderful.
okay? I didn't know
Yes.
if I was answering the question or not. I mean, what's the
Yes.
problem? They're pretty slim. Better than finding an ivory-billed woodpecker, but definitely probably greater than that, but probably not excellent. I put about 5%.
There you go. So many questions in the chat and Q&A that unfortunately we just didn't have the time to get to tonight, but the website for the lab is in the chat. So for folks that are interested in learning more or chatting further with the researchers that work at the Wolf Center, feel free to use that link to reach out and ask your questions. Joey, thank you so much for sharing the work that you've done previously and the Wolf Center's work moving forward. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. As a reminder, we are running that very generous match, thanks to an anonymous donor of ours, to garner funding for more collars for red wolves and coyotes in the wild. It's one of the ways the Wolf Conservation Center is supporting and working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a variety of other partners to further red wolf recovery. So feel free to click the link in the chat to donate as well. But of course, as we always say, the most effective way to support wolves is to use your voice and remain educated and speak up. So thank you to everyone for joining tonight and becoming very vocal and informed red wolf advocates. But we will hopefully see you all soon for another webinar. And remember, this will be posted on our website within the coming days. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And Joey, thank you again. Great having you as always.
Take it easy, folks.